Well, good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday to you. My name is Tim Harris. It is 10 o'clock. It is time for Tim with Tim, and it's as close to being time for daytime revival, so you better listen to me quick and then get in your car and get here. Get here. Daytime revival is so amazing. It's so much fun. Yesterday was such a rich service. Today is going to be fantastic. Please don't miss it. If you're within driving distance of Woodburn Baptist Church, get here. 10:30 today, also 10:30 tomorrow. Daytime revival at Woodburn. I'm just loving it. I am preaching my guts out this week, y'all. I am just preaching and preaching and preaching everywhere I turn around, but I love that. It's what I'm called to do, and daytime revival is just amazing. So come on out today. I'll see you here in just a minute, but let's get our Bible reading in for today. We're reading Deuteronomy today. I give you two chapters, Deuteronomy 16 and 17. So how were they? Did you read ahead? You good? Let's start with chapter 16. Chapter 16 describes the main festivals, the feasts, the celebrations of the Jewish calendar. I think this is just really amazing that this is part of the law, that this is part of the founding, principles of the covenant community of God. And it is, hey, y'all are going to celebrate, these are celebrations. Now, they're also solemn assemblies, make no mistake, but mostly these would be fun. It's like Christmas, and Thanksgiving. This is, creating that rhythm in the community's year, so that they not only have this balance of working, worship, and celebrating, but also in the course of the year, they're telling their own story back to themselves. Every one of these festivals, these feasts, they tell a part of their national story, their story with God, and it helps them to remember. And notice that refrain at the end of each description. You're going to remember. You're going to remember that you were slaves. You're going to remember what God has done. Starts with Passover in chapter 16, verse 1. Passover is one night, so to speak, in that larger festival of unleavened bread. Now, why a festival of unleavened bread? What's the deal with that? Well, leaven in many ways comes to represent impurity, the way impurity in a community or in your heart, or the way leaven in a loaf of bread will spread throughout spread silently but surely throughout the entire loaf. And so, Jesus will talk about that, for example. He'll use leaven, the leaven of the Pharisees, for example. This idea of something that comes in silently but is an impure or a destructive force. Now, that's not completely what the festival of unleavened bread is about, but it's not about that. It's also about just remembering the night that they were released from slavery in Egypt, and that final meal that they celebrated together when the death angel, so to speak, was passing over, and the Jews were preparing to flee. Remember that night they ate unleavened bread. Why? Because they didn't have time. That's the point. You had to eat supper that night with your suitcase in your hand and your shoes on and your staff in your other hand, and you just had to wolf it down. You ever had that kind of meal, And the point is, it takes time for bread to rise. And ain't nobody got time for that on Passover night. And so it's that idea that the meal was eaten in a hurry. It was eaten in haste. And so the Passover itself sort of reenacts that night and reenacts that hasteful meal. And so for that reason, there's no leaven in the bread at Passover. But then for 7 days, there's this festival of unleavened bread where they continue to eat flat bread that has no leaven, bread that doesn't rise, to commemorate what God has done in releasing them from slavery, and that whole observation of what God has done. Roast the lamb in the place the Lord your God chooses for his name to be honored. Again, you can't just do this wherever you want, however you want. Worship is going to be consolidated. Worship is going to be on God's terms, and we've talked about that. On the seventh day, proclaim another holy day in the honor of the Lord your God, and no work may be done on that day. So that concludes the festival of unleavened bread. The next one's the Feast of the Harvest, the festival of the harvest. And this just has to do with the time of harvest. This one is to be a celebration. This is to be a fun, joyous occasion to celebrate, God's provision from the earth. You bring a voluntary offering in proportion to the blessing. So again, that's a tithe there in proportion to your crops. And everybody celebrate. Celebrate with your sons, your daughters, your male, your servants, female servants, your Levites from towns, foreigners, orphans, widows, everybody. Everybody needs to get in on this celebration. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, so be careful to obey all these decrees. Third, the festival of, sometimes called the Feast of Booths, or the Festival of Shelters, the Feast of Tabernacles, all of that. We're talking about tents. The Festival of Tents. And this is to recognize and commemorate their wandering in the wilderness. In those days, they lived like it was a permanent camping trip. They slept in tents, they lived in tents, they'd pick up camp, set up camp somewhere else. And so at the Festival of Booths, I think this just sounds like the most fun. And I think it is fun. They would create little, huts, remember as a kid when you would take quilts or maybe this is just me, maybe it's just, I'm an old man. I remember just getting blankets and quilts and bedspreads from all over our house on a snow day or whatever, and draping them across the couch and the table and just making these, indoor, like tents or like clubhouses, whatever. You remember doing that? How much fun that was? Or like building a fort. Like me and my buddies used to build hay forts in the hayloft, or we built a fort, out of sticks and limbs in the woods. It's that kind of thing. You're just building a shelter to commemorate, when our fathers and mothers were wandering in the wilderness and they slept in tents, that they stayed in these little booths. And I just think it would be the most fun. And I think this must have been the one that the kids enjoyed the most, because everybody will sleep outside in a booth, in a hut, in a tabernacle. And I love that. Verses 16 and 17 kind of give a summary. Each year, every man in Israel must celebrate these three festivals: unleavened bread, Feast of the Harvest, Feast of the Shelters. Got to celebrate in the place that God chooses, and don't ever show up without a gift for the Lord in your hand. So you always bring an offering to the Lord. Everybody give as they're able. At the end of chapter 16, there's a word about appointing judges and officials for yourselves from each of your tribes and all the towns. So you have these local courts with judges and officials appointed from each tribe. You must never twist justice or show partiality. Bribes blind the eyes of the wise and corrupt the decisions of the godly. Oh my goodness. Let's put that on every courthouse in Warren County. Never twist justice or show partiality. Let me go on. I'll come back with some thoughts that apply there. Chapter 17, again, verses 1 to 7, another one of those like, what? If when you're living in your towns, you have a man or woman who does evil, serving other gods or any other definition of evil, stone them. You have to make sure there are 2 or 3 witnesses. You can't just have somebody who doesn't, like his ex-wife, says he is an idolater. It's got to be 2 or 3 witnesses. Then they cast the first stone, and then everybody else joins in. And that's how you purge the evil from among you. Now, again, we talked about this the other day. It says something about the national identity and the way for them. A breach of the covenant, sin in the camp, so to speak, is a national emergency. That they don't just see, this as being one person's problem. It's everybody's problem, and therefore it has to have a community answer. Again, we'll come back to that. What about a local case that gets too hard? We need a Supreme Court, right? So in that case, chapter 17 lays out that the Levitical priest, you can go to the Levitical priest at the temple, and they will be able to adjudicate more or less as a Supreme Court. Verses 14 and following through chapter 17 are guidelines for when you have a king. I think it's amazing. I just think it's amazing that that the Lord has that kind of foresight to go ahead and lay it out, because that's what they're going to do. But this is where I start to notice that king didn't, none of these guidelines were followed. You shouldn't have a whole lot of horses. I think, didn't Solomon, wasn't he like a horse trader? He had like a lot of horses. The king must not take a lot of wives. I think Solomon, didn't he also have like a lot of wives? And this is where you start to realize that while these laws sound really, really good, they're not going to keep them. I mean, again, don't make me preach the gospel because I will. I mean, they can't keep them, but there's not a lot of documentation or records at all that, like, for example, the first part of 17 that everybody loses their mind over. There's not a lot of evidence that they live this way. You read the rest of the Old Testament, you read the prophets in their preaching, and obviously they did not purge evil from their villages. Obviously, they did not take sin seriously. I mean, obviously, they didn't take holiness seriously. I mean, so before you get all upset about how, they had, this law, don't get too upset if it bothers you because they didn't do it, There's not a lot of evidence that they ever followed very many of these regulations at all. Again, I say read the prophets, which we've done together. Read the prophets, They didn't practice sabbatical years. And so there was a lot of poverty and people did lose their place in the community. The king actually did take a lot of wives and the king did actually collect horses, as a hobby. I mean, on and on we go. Verses 18 at the end of chapter 17, when you get a king, make him sit down with his own hand and copy out, this book of the law so that he's got his own copy in his own hand. And then that way he's going to learn to fear the Lord. And he can't say he didn't know because he wrote his own copy. Yeah, I don't know if they did that. By now, we've all read the history of the kings. I'm pretty sure they weren't doing this at all. Again, I'm not saying that as a joke or as a way of dismissing the law. I'm just showing you that it's just an awful good thing that Jesus came to save us, because if we had to follow laws to get saved, we'd all be lost, right? Pick up right here tomorrow, chapter 18 and 19. Again, 2 chapters, chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 19, verse 21. And I will see you in the morning, Lord willing, 10 o'clock for 10withTim. If I don't see you here in just a moment, 10:30, daytime revival here at Woodburn Baptist Church, today and tomorrow, last days, all right? I love you guys so much. I will see you in the morning, Lord willing, 10 o'clock for 10withTim.